Hey, Roger, welcome to the Digital Slice podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing fantastic, Brad. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, you bet. I have been looking forward to talking to you. I want to just start by asking you to kind of define for us what a branded podcast is.
Hmm. So it's a podcast that is funded by a brand or underwritten by a brand. You can think of it like any other branded content, where it's ideally content that is audience first and easy and great to consume. It just happens to be produced and given to you by the brand.
Okay. All right. So then why do most branded podcasts flop?
Because they're about the brand. I mean, the the average podcast that doesn't succeed from a branded standpoint is just a long form ad, really. And nobody wants to watch or listen to a 30-45 minute ad. A podcast is meant to be a very personal experience. It's intimate. You're literally talking to me. You're whispering in my ears right now. You're generally consuming it on your own. And it's usually on a topic that you feel quite passionate about. Now, insert a brand into that conversation and make the brand sort of spout off about itself and talk about itself and its services and its offerings. And our CEO did this and our CFO did that. And it begins to just get drowned out. So the way we look at it, and my firm is that it should be a great podcast first that just happens to be brought to you by a brand.
Oh, that makes sense. So if if we're doing a branded podcast, what would be the ROI? What's the
Mm.
ROI of podcast?
Yeah. So when it comes to a branded podcast, actually, when it comes to podcasts in general, there's no better medium for engagement. So we look at the listen length or the watch length. Now, our firm aims for an average of about 80% listen through rate for every episode. That means that the average listener is pretty much making it through the entire episode. And when we do that math, and you can imagine a brand coming out with an episode every, let's say, 2 weeks. Well, yeah, and each episode is 30 to 45 minutes. Some of them are an hour. You do the math there, and each audience member is spending hours with the brand, which is really unmatched anywhere else in marketing these days, especially in content marketing. We also look at, we can look at conversions. So who's listened to the podcast and ended up on the website? We can look at brand lift, which we do through brand lift studies, of those that listen to the podcast. How do they then feel more favorable towards the brand? And then there's brand impact studies. So there's a ton of different things that we can be looking at. A lot of times brands, especially in the B2B space, will look at podcasts as a tool for thought leadership. So that's something that can easily be measured, whether it's through surveys or, just getting a feel for, what the audience, how the audience is, impacted by the brand. And then there's also the, sort of the quantitative, sorry, qualitative feedback that you get from your podcast audience. A podcast audience is incredibly generous when it comes to their feedback and their comments, because this is their personal time. They're engaged with this show. They want it to succeed. They want it to be right for them. And oftentimes you'll hear a ton of feedback from that audience, and that can be feedback about the brand itself, or the show itself.
Interesting. So I personally listen to several podcasts a week to see if I can pick up any tips. And it seems to me that a lot of podcasts today are like this podcast, doing audio and video. What have you seen? What's the trend? Is that a best practice? Talk to me about video versus audio.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize when it comes to the choice of video versus audio, there's not necessarily a best practice, but there is when it comes to, what's going to be right for your specific brand. So we always ask the question, so let's take video, for example. Sort of, we ask the question, why? Why should your brand be on video? Do you have any data that shows that your audience is already using YouTube a lot? Perhaps you have other videos that are on YouTube that have, been successful. When we think about the actual content, there is different content that is, probably more right for audio, specifically longer form. If it is quite long, and perhaps it has more of a, like a narrative arc to it. You can imagine, expecting that narrative arc to translate into video is a very expensive proposition, because quite quickly you're starting to produce a documentary. So there's just that side of it. But what we're finding through the data, a report just recently came out, that it was done by Sounds Profitable, and it showed that audiences are switching back and forth throughout the day. So they could start watching your podcast via video, and then get interrupted by life, put it on pause, and then as they're brushing their teeth the next morning, they can turn on the audio version and sort of select whereabouts they were in the episode and start listening there. And so we're starting to see a lot of device switching throughout the industry. But then there are some podcasts that, I can definitively say, based on the data, are more suitable to, depending on certain brands. For example, in the B2B category, there's some research that came out from a group called Signal Hill Insights that shows that senior executives in business over-index when it comes to audio listening versus video. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, they're always on the go, a lot of travel, they're at they're at the gym, they're going throughout their day. They're not able to stare down at a YouTube video throughout the day. So you see a huge over-index in audio there. So the answer is, just like any good marketer, it depends.
Great. Yeah, I was in a networking group at one point, and several of the people said to me that they preferred the audio over the video because they usually did it while they were on a walk or they were working out. And they were also the group that told me that my hour-long podcasts were too long, and they needed them shorter. And I remember looking at one of the guys and saying, well, I don't know, it looks like you could have used an hour on your treadmill. And I think he stopped listening soon after that.
That's funny. Well, there's your qualitative feedback.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It is something that we've done for a while, is both, because like you said, I mean, who knows? But I mean, some people are going to start it and switch, and
I'll say that that's one of the beautiful things about podcasting in general is the organic nature to it. I mean, a podcast is a living, breathing thing, and it is full of data. It spits out a ton of data at you. So if the data is showing that, hey, we're just not getting as much engagement on YouTube as we are on audio, well, then let's shift to more focus on audio, or vice versa. And it can still be both, or you can take a bit of a break from one and try out the other and do some A/B testing. There's really no rules to podcasting. That was just one of the great things about it.
Yeah. So how do we work a podcast into our marketing funnels and repurpose it properly?
Yeah. So we like to think of a podcast as pillar content, when it comes to a brand's content program, meaning it's perfect sitting in the middle of the program. So, because every episode, if you plan it properly, is going to be, you can easily parlay that into, each episode can be parlayed into a blog post, because you're going to get a generated transcript that you're going to be able to, use and alter, produce a blog post with it. Perhaps there's a newsletter article. You're going to be able to turn it into snippets for social. We've had clients use their podcasts for live events. Some have even used it in some of their white papers or their annual reports. Really, sky's the limit as to how you use it. But it is beneficial for you to sort of think about that in advance, so that as you're planning out the show, and each episode, you're looking for those key moments going into it. Well, obviously, you want to capture those key moments afterwards, but instead of just sort of like seeing what you got, always best to kind of think in advance, how best can we sort of frame some of these conversations so we can use some of these pieces down the road.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you've talked a lot about data, and I'm big on making data-driven decisions. It seems like in order to gather data, or in order to get the data to gather, that you have to have an audience. So, what are some tactics that one can use to increase the size of an audience?
Yeah, so one of the best things you can do is get a good understanding of what else your podcast audience is listening to or engaged with. So there are some tools out there right now that you can use to determine what the other podcasts are that your audience is listening to, and then literally do the legwork to reach out to some of those podcasts and try to strike some deals with them, where perhaps you can go on their show as a guest in exchange for maybe them coming on your show as a guest, or perhaps you're featuring them in your social content as maybe a friend of the podcast in exchange for them doing the same. You're essentially sharing audiences that way. Oftentimes we'll do stream drops where we'll take an episode and provide it to another show, and they've added it to their podcast stream as a bonus episode for their audience.
Huh.
Again, there's really no rules to this. Of course, there's the social push that we see a lot these days. We're leveraging snippets from the show. That works really, really well on video. I'd say less so on audio. And I think that has mostly to do with the algorithms. So just promoting a show via YouTube, takes advantage of the algorithm way better than some of the other channels. And then there's just different PR pushes you can do, but also leveraging your guests, making sure that your guests are set up to help share the show, share their episodes, leveraging their audiences. And then finally, there's different ways that you can be pitching Apple Podcasts and Spotify on getting your show featured within their directories. So if you go to the Apple Podcast website, there is information where you can essentially contact them and pitch them on why your show should be featured. I can promise you that there's no algorithm to beat when it comes to these sorts of decisions. It's all made by an editorial team in Cupertino, California, that gets broken down by country and then gets broken down by category. And you can pitch them on why you should have your show featured in one of those categories.
Ah, interesting. Very interesting. So I understand that you have worked with some very big companies, and I'm wondering if you could pick a few lessons learned from some of those big companies and share that with us.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that most of the big companies that we work with, have a lot of layers and a lot of different voices and hands that want to be part of the show, at least as part of the show's structure and production. And I think knowing that in advance, for example, some of the pharmaceutical companies that we work with have a lot of medical regulation that they need the show to pass through. So I think it's it's beneficial to add extra time for that, but also plan that out in advance. Really get in there and help the podcast concept sort of be sold in multiple different departments in the company. I think one of the best things that you can do, and the most amount of time you should really spend from a strategic upfront process, is to just really understand what the job is of your podcast. A lot of times we see brands creating podcasts for podcast's sake, but really, taking the time to understand, what does this podcast need to do exactly for the brand? Is it meant to, increase brand love? Is it meant to increase trust? Is it meant to be for thought leadership purposes. Knowing that in advance can be incredibly beneficial, and then understand who your audience is, like not just who they are from a demographic standpoint, but what other podcasts are they listening to? What other media are they consuming? Because your podcast needs to compete with video games and movies on Netflix and reading a book. And, you can imagine all the other activities that you could be doing on your free time. Your show needs to be that good in order to make it into their sort of entertainment lineup. And then finally, what are the results that you're looking for with the show? So at the end of the day, when the show has been out there for, let's say, a year, how do you know it's been successful? And how are you going to measure that? So I think sort of the planning in advance is really key.
Yeah, you mentioned podcasting, and you mentioned pharmaceutical companies. I do some work with some financial services providers who have compliance issues, and I have pitched the idea to them of doing podcasts, and for the most part, too much brain damage. I have to go through compliance, and what are your thoughts sort of on the creative versus compliance sort of tightrope?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of it comes down to putting yourself in their shoes and acknowledging the role that they have to play. Don't treat it as an adversarial relationship. And I think also trust that they are going to put themselves in your shoes as well, or your client's shoes, whoever is leading it internally at the financial brand you're working with, and just keeping the communication going, and try not to hide anything from them, try not to surprise them with anything, factor into the timeline the amount of time it takes for them to review, and really come at them with a respectful sort of position on why XYZ needs to happen from a communication standpoint, and while also going in with an open mind as to the fact that there's a very good chance it's not just immediately 100% going to be approved. There's going to have to be some sort of wiggle room in there, because that's just it's just the nature of financial institutions.
Yeah. You mentioned working with companies that have many layers, and I'm wondering if there's some advice you can give to pitching a podcast internally, and how to go up the chain and finally get the C-suite to give approval.
Yeah, I think, again, understanding or thinking in advance as to where some of the potential trouble spots might be, but also really wrapping your pitch around the ROI side of things. This isn't just a podcast for podcast's sake. A podcast these days can actually improve and impact the brand, in a number of positive ways. And so to be able to outline that for those that maybe don't really understand the ROI side of this, whether they're the CMO or CEO, sometimes the CFO, really getting them to understand sort of what that return is going to be on the investment is key. And then, of course, outlining all the different, when I say that a brand shouldn't really, be part of the podcast, I by no means, expect that there's going to be no mention at all of the brand. So I think it's important to outline, where are those brand touch points going to be in the show? Is it going to be, aside from maybe the artwork or the intro to the show, is there going to be maybe a midpoint rebrand where it's, hey, you've been listening to the Digital Slice, brought to you by XYZ. Stay tuned for the second half of our episode. We're going to talk to so-and-so. In the meantime, if you want to learn more about today's topic, you can go to xyz.com and download this form, or, what's the next step to get them perhaps moving down your funnel, but also keeping them within the brand ecosystem. So, outlining those sorts of opportunities, I think, is key before they start thinking about it themselves. So they know that there's some thought that's gone into this from a strategic standpoint.
Yeah, that makes good sense. So, Roger, give me one or two takeaways you want listeners to take away from our discussion.
I think the biggest takeaway is to really think about what the job is of the podcast that you're producing for your company. what the who the audience is, and what do they need out of this show? What exactly is going to get them to not only listen or watch, but continue listening and watching, and then the result that you're looking for. The last thing I'll leave with is, there are a lot of podcasts these days. I'm not going to deny that for at all. It's really important to take some creative leaps. Try some things that perhaps might scare you a little bit. We have never taken a creative risk with our clients that has not turned out into something that was fantastic and great and increased the audience size and increased the quality of the audience. I think when it comes to brands and entertainment, there's always benefit in sort of shooting your shot and going for something bigger and more fun than you originally planned.
Oh, great. Take a minute and tell us a little bit about your company and what you do and who you do it for.
Yeah, so we're JAR Podcast Solutions. We produce, measure, and market podcasts on behalf of some of the world's biggest brands. We mostly work with mid to large size enterprise brands, as well as nonprofits. We also specialize in internal podcasts, meaning podcasts exclusively for companies' employees. They can, everyone can learn more about us at jarpodcast.com or check me out on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Okay, great. Roger, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks, Brad.
You bet.